Ko te kaua o te ora, ko te kaua o te ora. Ko te kaua o te ora tēnei ka takina. Ko te kaua o te ora tēnei ka hikina. Ei, tapu mai, koea ko rangi e tū nei. Tapu mai, koea ko papa e takoto nei. Tapu mai, koea ko tēnei mana. Mana mai, mana atu. Mauri mai, mauri atu. Tapu mai, tapu atu. Tiaki mai, tiaki atu. Haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. Tēnā koutou, nau mai, tauti mai ki tēnei wānanga whakamutunga mo te kōmata o te tonga. Nōku te Waimārie, ki te whiriwhiri i ngā kōrero o tēnei wānanga, nō reira, tēnei te mihi nunu kia koutou, kua tai mai ki te whakarongo, ki enei o ngā kai kōrero, Māma Timoteo, Lauren Vargo, koutou ko Kenny Bell, tēnei te mihi nunui kia koutou te tokotoru nei. Kia ora everyone, it's fantastic to have you all here. Those of you listening, this is our last webinar for Te Kōmata o Te Tonga. The Life of the Deep South National Science Challenge comes to an end at the end of next week. So welcome everyone to the webinar. Thank you for your time. I'm really excited and honoured to be able to facilitate the conversation today between our three amazing speakers, very diverse group of speakers who come from all manner of spaces and places, backgrounds, education and experience, but I think will make for a really, really interesting discussion here today. We wanted to pull this webinar together really, firstly, to acknowledge the breadth and diversity and depth of experience and research that has been carried out in Te Kōmata o Te Tonga, the Deep South National Science Challenge. We've got three amazing speakers here, not necessarily representative of everything that's happened in the challenge, but that have come from different parts of the challenge itself. Everything we are covering, from glaciers to Te Tiriti, from rangatahi in the Pacific to insurance and all manner of other things that might be scattered in between as well. And it's with a view to having a conversation about what pathways, research pathways, action and activation pathways we can see as researchers in the challenge and moving out of the challenge. What are the pathways we can see moving through and into our climate futures? What does that look, feel, smell, taste? All of those things. What is that like for us? So really excited. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're gonna, the structure of today's webinar will be that each of our presenters will have 10 minutes or thereabouts to share a bit of a presentation, who they are, what they've been doing, all of the awesomeness that is sitting in their research. And then after those 10 minutes, we'll move into discussion. After that time, we'll move into discussion. Questions facilitated by and with me, but we would also encourage you, please do drop your own questions into the Q&A box as people are talking, or I will open up for questions towards the end as well. We would encourage questions that can be put to all of the panelists. So if you have got specific questions about each of the panelists' research, feel free to drop those maybe in the chat and we can address them if we've got time. But what we want to facilitate today is discussion across all of our projects. So partai that can kind of, we can all feed into would be really encouraged as well. I just want to acknowledge before I hand over to our speakers that there is a lot going on in our country and in our world. And I do really want to acknowledge all of the struggles that are happening across our world. And I won't name all of them, I think we're all aware, but I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, you know, for a lot of us, turning up here in this space means that we put aside some of those other struggles that we are managing or warding off or standing in solidarity with, to be able to be present in this space. But those struggles, those really important pieces of work that we have for justice across the board, both for our environment and for people, still exist and are still there. So yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that before we move into our presentations. I won't go into huge detail and big introductions for this amazing team of people, but I do want to acknowledge them and say thank you for your time and your energy, and for leaning into the fact that we are a diverse group, and that we're going to have some really interesting conversations over the next hour and a half. So I will stop talking. And I will pass over first of all to Lauren Vargo and the glaciers. The time is yours, Lauren.
Thanks so much. All right, can you see that? Sweet. Ko Lauren Vargo toku ingoa. My name is Lauren, and I'll be talking kind of about a more physical science side, about snow and ice in a changing climate. And so a lot of this is part of the Deep South project that I'm a part of, together with researchers at the University of Otago in Niwa. But the questions that we were given, like in the introduction, are also quite broad. So thinking about kind of all of this work in a broader context of science in New Zealand and what we should be thinking about and why. So first, I'll kind of introduce us to why we should care about snow and ice. This is a piece of art from a friend of mine, and it shows some glaciers and some snow up in the mountains, and some of the kind of reasons why they're important to us. So a big one when we talk about glaciers is often sea level rise. So we've had about 10 centimeters of sea level rise over the past 30 years, and about a quarter of that has been from melting glaciers. But there's this caveat that not much of that is from glaciers in New Zealand. Our glaciers have not as much volume as kind of those big ones in Alaska and other parts of the world that are contributing more. So why do we care about glaciers in New Zealand and snow? A big one is water. So this drinking water, irrigation, hydropower. As glaciers melt and as snow melts, we get water for resources for those things. And as glaciers get smaller, or as less precipitation falls as snow, or at different times of the year falling as snow, the amount of water resources that we get for hydropower or irrigation can change. We also care about these things for natural hazards. So there are places on the West Coast where we no longer have walking tracks or access to getting into the mountains and seeing these places, because as the glaciers have been melting, increases in sediment, increases in flooding have taken out those paths. There have also been studies that have been done in New Zealand and around the world that have shown that, now we're getting up to this outdoor recreation tab that I added, that as these icy landscapes have changed, there's less access to them in the outdoors, and it becomes less safe to kind of get around these places for people who are trying to get out into the mountains. Tourism is also a big part. There was a stat that showed that over 2 million people visited areas with snow and ice in New Zealand in 1 year, though that was before COVID. And then finally, there's kind of cultural and religious connections to these landscapes, including in New Zealand with the connections to glaciers like the Franz Josef Glacier or the Ka Roimata o Hine Hukatere. So that's why we care about these. And so what do they look like? So when we think about glaciers or ice in New Zealand, there are almost 3,000 glaciers. Most of them are in the central southern Alps. So that's what this photo is showing us. All the blue and red are glaciers, with just a few on Mount Ruapehu. This photo over here shows us Brewster Glacier. So it's one of the most studied glaciers in New Zealand, but just gives you an idea of what these look like. So glaciers are these bodies of ice that stick around in the mountains in the winter, but also in the summer. So in the summer, they look like this. We can see these fresh ice surfaces. But in the winter, this whole landscape will just get covered with snow. Yeah. And then snow in New Zealand. So there are a few places that NIWA measures how much snow falls. And here's something that it might look like. So as we go up into the mountains, as we get higher in elevation, it will get colder. And eventually it gets cold enough for snow to start falling. So that's what we can see in this photo here. We're a bit lower in the valley, so it's not cold enough for snow. And then we get higher and we get the snowfall. In New Zealand, if we think about snow over the hydrological year, from the start of April to the end of March, we start to get snow maybe in the start of April, but it really starts to kind of build up in the start of winter. We get a peak of it sometime in September, October, and then we see that snow melt throughout the spring. And there's a bit of time where, except at the highest elevations, there is no snow. But I'll just point out that there are other things besides temperature, so getting colder as we get higher in elevation, that drive where our snow is. So things like snow blowing around in the mountains. This is a photo from Mueller Hut. And snow avalanching. And so we have this one measurement from NIWA. They actually do this for a handful of places across the Southern Alps. But understanding where snow is and when it's where it is important when we think back to that slide for why we care about these icy landscapes. So that kind of sets the scene for our Deep South research. So these next few slides are from Todd Redpath at the University of Otago. So he's working on this part of the project, mapping snow depth from satellites in space. So this is a map of the Jolly catchment. It's just outside Aoraki Mount Cook. Here's the Tasman Glacier, I believe. And so just to the east of that area. And so we can see from this really high resolution, high quality satellite view, snow in this photo. In our project, the group from Otago, got these maps of snow for a few dates throughout the year 2012. They're able to use some really smart techniques to not just look at where in space snow is, which we can see from this photo. We can see where there's the white snow and where there's not the white snow, but to get elevation maps. So to look at changes in the depth of the snow over the course of that year. And so that's what this photo shows here. So the pink lines are just separating this catchment into different elevation bands to give us a way to analyze the data. But the map below it is looking at snow depth over changes in snow depth over time. So we see places where the snow depth might have increased and decreased, where there's some blues and maybe not really any reds, but lighter blues. And so we can use those measurements to understand where in that catchment there's snow and how that changes throughout the kind of autumn, winter, and spring. And so that's what this plot is showing. So we're looking at different elevations in that catchment and what's the distribution of snow over those elevations, but for a few different dates in time. So we start out with this date in early June where we see kind of the most straightforward thing going on, where we get a peak and then it kind of comes back down. But as we go throughout the winter, so later in June into September, the next few dates in this time series, we start to see the bottom of this curve kind of flatten out. So that means we're seeing more snow at lower elevations. So some of that will come from increases in snowfall, but is also evidence for redistribution of snow. So not just temperatures driving where we're getting snow, but also things like avalanching. And so that brings us to the second part of our project. So can we use those measurements to get a better idea of where snow is, not just in the places we have those measurements, but in the mountains in New Zealand as a whole? And we can do that using numerical models. So we can use climate inputs, things like temperature and precipitation, and simulate where snow should be and shouldn't be. So this is that same catchment that we saw before. And here, snow depth is being simulated in a really simple way. So it's just showing an increase in snow depth with temperature. But when we use those measurements to help incorporate avalanching into this simulation, we can see this kind of pretty and also more realistic image of what snow depth looks like. So we see snow accumulating in these valleys where it might have avalanched down. We see steep cliff faces in places like this where snow can't accumulate because it just avalanches right off. Yeah, and so we're able to measure how snow, where snow is from space, how that changes over the year, and then use those measurements to look at that in a larger scale or for times when we don't have those measurements. And so one of the questions that we were asked to think about was, what are challenges that we face in New Zealand? And so I thought that kind of looking at those different scales of snow led into this, thinking about international scale studies where there are these countries that kind of have huge amounts of resources. Researchers in New Zealand, there are a handful of people who study snow and ice. A large part of that handful was on the Steep South project. And so how do we make these big international studies useful for us in New Zealand? So this figure that we're looking at here came from a recent international study that looked at how annual snow-covered days, so the days when there's snow, changes in the future with climate change. And so they looked at it, like you can see, for all these mountainous regions around the world, including New Zealand. And so what's important that they did find was that if this is us today in the Southern Alps, and if we go all the way over here, this is us in the future in a scenario where we do a lot to mitigate climate change in the green, or in scenarios where we don't do much to mitigate climate change, we see big reductions in the amount of snow-covered days. But the problem is these studies are, to do them internationally, they're done really coarsely for New Zealand. And so thinking about, is it telling us useful things when we think about what's the future for the ski industry here? And if not, how can we use these to learn about things that are useful for New Zealand? So just to give an example, these studies will use output from global climate models, and those simulate climate around the Earth by turning the Earth into a series of grids. Places like New Zealand, the whole of the Southern Alps are usually made up by just one or two grid boxes. And so that just kind of shows the importance of groups like NIWA who do the downscaling, and then scientists in New Zealand who use those downscaled models, so models that are more relevant to New Zealand to answer questions that we're relevant in or that we're interested in. And so another example of those kind of that change in scale is thinking about something called peak water. And so a group from Europe a few years ago looked at this, and this plot is showing the idea that our blue line is glacier volume. And so over time, our glacier volume is decreasing. And as that glacier melts, the volume's decreasing, we get an increase in glacier runoff. And so that's this red line here. And at some point, there should be this time of peak water where our runoff hits a maximum, but then the glacier has become too small and the amount of runoff actually starts decreasing, and at some point is smaller than it was before that glacier started melting. So there was a wonderful international study that looked at this around the world and included New Zealand, but again, didn't really do it in a way that's useful for us to think about. It looked at the Clutha catchment, which doesn't actually have as much input of glacier meltwater as lots of other catchments in New Zealand. So answering these questions that people around the world are looking at, but maybe not applying them to New Zealand in ways that we need. I also just wanted to highlight this research that we're doing studying glaciers and how glaciers are changing. So again, this is the Brewster Glacier. The same groups that are part of this Deep South project do quite a bit of research here. And so we're looking at how it's changing in this map, changing area, or we're looking at photographs of it from 2016 to 2019. And so we can see a change in area between those 2 years. We can see in 2019, we lose some ice around here and kind of all around. We can also use the photographs that generated that mosaic to look at how the glacier surface elevation changes over time. So we can see that on average, it lost almost 7 meters of water equivalent over those 3 years. And so again, we care about this because of all the reasons that we care about glaciers that I noted on that first slide. But just making these measurements for one glacier, when there are almost 3,000 in New Zealand, it would be great to have more. So there are ways that this gets scaled up. NIWA runs the end of summer snowline survey. That involves monitoring about 50 New Zealand glaciers from photographs taken every year. It results in something that looks like this, a record of snowline anomalies, but really what we care about are years when there's not much snow on the glaciers. It suggests that they lost mass. And years when there's a lot of snow on the glaciers suggests that they gained mass. So we can use those measurements that that I showed in that previous slide to validate kind of estimates of glacier change that this shows. But then again, this one is for only a subset of New Zealand glaciers, and two isn't a direct measurement. It's just telling us a relative gain or loss. And so now going back to an international study that this is a part of. So here we're looking at a map of the Aotearoa Mount Cook region. It's just about this region. And the colors show change in surface elevation over the different years that we're kind of flipping through. And what really stands out are these darkening red colors towards the 2015-2019 period. And so those are the glaciers. So we're looking at the Tasman Glacier here, the Fox Glacier here, the Franz Josef Glacier right here. And those really dark red colors indicate that the surface elevation of that ice is lowering, so telling us that the glaciers are melting. This is a wonderful study, but again, it's part of this big international study that looked at glacier change around the world. And while it was one of the first, maybe the first, piece of work to show New Zealand-wide glacier change, in it, New Zealand has some of the largest uncertainties and lowest kind of coverage of measurements compared to all of the other regions in the world. So I guess, again, just trying to get at the point of how do we do things that groups internationally are doing, but with New Zealand being so small, making that research useful to what we need. So now thinking about snow and ice going forward. Again, this is the glaciers in the Aotearoa Mount Cook region, and this is work from Brian Anderson, who's a part of this Deep South project. This is different work, looking at what the glaciers might look like in the future. So in In this map, the blue shows where glaciers are today. With 2 degrees of warming, the blue shows where glaciers will be in that climate. We get about 50% of the ice gone, which is a lot, but the glaciers still look recognizable to what they do today. We still have these big areas of accumulation in the Franz Josef and Fox glaciers. We get tongues coming down. The Tasman Glacier looks like something. Yeah. But in a 5-degree warming world, we get 90% of ice loss and pretty unrecognizable to what the area looks like today. There's really just ice kind of at the highest peaks. And so I guess I wanted to use that to illustrate that kind of with climate change and with these icy landscapes changing, there is a choice that we have. So the idea of, can we keep ourselves in this 2-degree warming scenario? Absolutely. Will we? I like this little stick figure guy. But another one of the questions that was posed to us was what makes us hopeful. So one thing that makes me feel hopeful that we can reach this 2-degree warming scenario, kind of for these icy parts of our planet, for all the reasons that we depend on them, but then also for what they represent. So glaciers are a really nice way to think about climate change. It's a lot harder to see 0.5 degree of warming or a few centimeters of sea level rise. So not just the reasons why we directly care about glaciers, but also kind of thinking about them as representing climate change as a whole. COVID is something that makes me feel a bit hopeful, in the sense that governments implemented strategies and pretty much everyone kind of realized that we should do that. So thinking about how that maybe shows us that it is possible, at least, to kind of get to that more optimistic scenario. And then something else that makes me hopeful, combined with a plug for things that I do, is I do a lot of teaching, both undergraduate classes, but also this program called Girls on Ice, where we take teen girls on expeditions into the mountains to show them that science, outdoor exploration, and art is cool and fun. And so seeing how interested kind of kids are when we teach them about science, both in the sense that they're really hopeful, really optimistic, really interested, but also thinking about how to answer these questions and solve these problems, we probably need more voices, more kind of diverse backgrounds working on these. And so kind of trying to do our part in leading programs like that and teaching kids. So that's all for me. Yeah, I will stop sharing.
Tēnā koe, Lauren. He tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. It's the last bit of a line from quite a well-known karakia here in Aotearoa. It's "May the dawn rise red-tipped on ice, snow and frost." I can't help but feel a little sad for our whenua and for our whānau, well, for all of us, but particularly for our iwi and hapu down south. But I did just want to say, a lot of those graphics looked very much like parts of the body. There was one that looked like a lung. There was others that looked like the blood, pumping through our bodies and the veins. And, I think, what you've shared for some of us is all new, really interesting, wonderful kōrero, and really important science that's happening. But also, connecting it to our bodies, connecting it to our understanding of Aotearoa as our Earth Mother, and all of the things that we might do to care for her and our context as Aotearoa in the broader context of our world as well. Just a few of the things that kind of have made me think, Lauren. And for those of you listening, if you've got thoughts, reflections, questions, please start to put those in the chat now. They'll help to generate our thinking for our discussion moving forward. Really thank you, Lauren, for sharing and for the work that you do as well, and looking forward to some more kōrero after our next speakers.
Thanks for
We're
inviting me.
going to move from the snow and ice to the beautiful Rarotonga, the Cook Islands, the sun, the sea, the Pacific, and to our very sunny Mama Timoteo. Kea koe te wā e te whanaunga. The time is yours to share. Thank you.
Oh, kia rana, everyone. Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Mama Timoteo. I am one of the researchers on the Mana Rangatahi project here in Aotearoa Christchurch. I have the wonderful Max going to be controlling the slides. I've relinquished control. This is very, very new to me. But I thought today what we're going to do is we're going to briefly just chat about the really cool mahi that we've been doing alongside some of my thesis work as well. So I just recently finished, done and dusted the thesis, the PhD thesis. So that is now gone. And now I have the opportunity to share some of that for us. So Max, would you be able to pop that up for us, please? Oh. Wonderful. So we'll just click on to the next one. So this is Mana Rangatahi Climate Change Leadership and Decision Making. Next, please, Max. Thank you so much. Here, just real quick, team, we have our beautiful research team. Very beautiful, very smart, how blessed we are. And the collaborators there as well. But that's enough of them. On to the next one. Thank you very much. So sorry, Tim, just going to pop up my notes. So Mana Rangatahi was an action research and leadership program which where we were working with two kura in high-risk flooding areas in Aotearoa Christchurch. So that was with Te Tiriti and Te Pā. And a question that originally drove us to this research was, how can we support Indigenous young people's capacity to lead in climate change decision-making for adaptation? We used an intergenerational storytelling approach, which had been trialled in Indigenous communities in the Arctic as a way to support Indigenous young people facing significant decisions in the future. Now, we know that Indigenous young people, Māori and Pacific, are already at the forefront of climate impact, and often diaspora communities relocating to areas that are also exposed to new climate hazards, and in this case, families living in flood-prone areas. But we also know that it is important to start from community strengths, not deficits. So the point is that Indigenous people don't need to necessarily solve or adapt to climate change, rather that they are supported to begin to chart Indigenous futures in line with aspirations of mana motuhake, which we by which necessity must engage with climate challenges and other significant problems like racism, inequality, and the ongoing impacts of colonization. Now, often those things we feel aren't adequately spoken about when we're talking about topics like climate change. Next one, please, Max. So what do we think that we've done kind of well, not to toot our own horns, but pretty well in this research? So our research recognizes, and this isn't also new, like a lot of the stuff where we might be sharing for our research anyway, the community already knows. It's just, it being brought into these spaces. So our research recognizes that Māori and Pacific young people already have pre-existing strengths and capabilities that can uniquely contribute to addressing complex climate challenges. Our study highlights the power of cultural, strength-based intergenerational support. So that includes things like storytelling, leadership role modeling, and mentoring. Our study also really highlights the distinctive and related challenges for Pacific and Māori young people, education about climate needs, need to support rangatahi to see themselves as part of a network of distributed leadership, or people that you can count on to really help solve these problems. So rather than focus on responsibility of youth today, identifying the networks of community support is really important, because processes of colonization has actually disrupted, in some regard, a lot of the networks for collective leadership. Now, a significant point of this research with the Mana Rangatahi project is to emphasize the strength of our Māori and Pacific communities' agency and sovereignty in their own futures and decision making. We'll just click on to the next one, please, Max. So what are some of these like unspoken, nuanced challenges here that we are going to see here in Aotearoa? Now, the more nuanced climate challenges are intersectional and highlight both similarities and differences amongst Indigenous communities, not one size fits all. In climate adaptation, like even Pacific communities who are members of diaspora have distinctive community ambitions and needs to do needs in the across, the hapu across the country as well. So one of the examples that I'd like to pull forward that was also embedded in my thesis was highlighting that Pacific people who are likely to migrate here to Aotearoa New Zealand, possibly due to the consequences of climate change, will do so not necessarily as individuals, but as a collective, a community, even a village. Much of the support for Pacific migration actually falls heavily on Pacific families and communities that are already present here in Aotearoa. So I think churches and community groups will often offer new support or support for new migrant families and communities. So one of the most important findings indicated the socioeconomic impacts of the potential migration for Pacific peoples here to Aotearoa and what that looks like for Pacific peoples that are already here. Oftentimes Pacific families in New Zealand are in lower income groups, and supporting migrant families actually place additional responsibilities onto these families. So an example of that is the estimated increase of costs in the household. So research shows that could actually go up by 30 to 60%. And that includes things like food, power, heating, and there's actually things like associated costs with finding employment and immigration processing. Another one here is lower educational outcomes are possible for Pacific peoples, as we see that some folks will leave education in search of work to actually support their families. Also, just another one that's actually quite specific to our research, one of the whalanoa that we held was actually in the local library. Now, this local library is actually located in the closest mall, the local mall. But what a lot of us found out is for a lot of our younger folks, Pacific and Māori, we know that they are policed at a higher level. We also found out that a lot of the students from a particular college that we were working with were actually banned from the mall. And it means that if they're banned from the mall, so where we were holding the talanoa was in the library, which the library was supposed to be, the safe space where the students could come, they could learn, they could read, they could hang out, do all these things. But they didn't actually have access to it because they were actually barred from the mall. So it's all these things that some of us may not think about, but actually impact. And where the mall was actually located was on the second floor of the mall, where the library was, sorry. And it was an area where if flooding was to happen, they'd been asked to actually evacuate to these kind of spaces. So just being mindful of things like that. What this demonstrated that was basically for Pacific peoples, the navigation of climate change impacts and consequences actually reach far beyond their own individual experiences and that of their immediate family. This research demonstrates the impact of climate change, specifically for Pacific peoples and Indigenous folks, are going to reach them in ways that some, including the government, may not actually have considered. So we'll just switch on to the next one, Max, please. So when it comes to what are some of the questions that we should be asking or answering, there's a lot, but two of the questions that really helped me fuel my own research, one of them being whose voices and lived experiences are being heard and amplified, and whose voices and lived experiences are often spoken for, ignored, or silenced. The other one is, how can we begin to approach climate change challenges with a more intersectional lens? Intersectionality and a real understanding the really complex and nuanced ways that individuals exist, but also communities exist, and how they navigate these challenges is very important. Max, we'll just pop onto the next one. Hopefulness. What makes us hopeful? This one is a bit of a tough one, team. And there's a couple of folks on here that I'd spoken to this about previously, but something that I wanted to pull was actually from my research as well. A participant, I don't like calling them participants because they're part of my community. Do you know what I mean? It just feels bad. Anyway, research, the navigation complex. Anyway, one of my participants spoke about something about hopefulness, and I just wanted to share that with you here. Now this person is a young mum, previously just had her daughter, and this is what she shared with me. She says, we've just got to keep pushing, because if we don't, then that's our livelihoods, that's our culture. So climate change has now influenced my perspective about the future. I feel like I'm forced to be hopeful because I refuse to accept anything less than a world that my girl deserves and that our people deserve. So that was just a small snippet there. And it was interesting how it was like the fact that I don't really have a choice in being hopeful, but also I want to emphasize the fact that hopefulness must be accompanied by action. And recently I just did a video for the rainbow community and for our community, and we were talking about what allyship means. And I think allyship, we forget that it's a verb, like it's a doing word. So when we talk about hopefulness, the action part of it is so important. So if we just switch over to the very last one, Max, hopefully I haven't taken up too much of your time, but in terms of our learnings from the Deep South and this project, there's been so many, but the couple that I just want to share with you. So in terms of communities of young people we've worked with, taking the time to build relationships and trust and good community is essential, as it is a commitment to stay supporting these communities after the projects end. So too often, research grants have a fixed timeline and milestones which don't meet the needs of the community in their timelines and their priorities. So in the restructuring of research that is coming, finding ways to make sure there's like, is this a word, like longitudinal? Longitudinal, look at me. I didn't just use all the big words in my thesis, I'm splitting them out here, but these projects that are able to fit with the timelines of the communities, not just a tip box thing that we do for research as well. The projects and partnerships with communities will also be very important. In many ways, the key lessons is to center the community, not necessarily the problem of climate change, but focus on what are the aspirations and ambitions and hopes of the community. So climate change is then put in the context of a problem, but to be addressed in the course of addressing, community flourishing. This is very nuanced, but I think is an important argument. And to teach about climate change is a key finding of our study. It is to start with, it's not really to start with the problem. Instead, we want to start with a position of strength. So decenter in a way climate and instead focus on the strengths of the community in past problem solving. So that's what we did a lot. We spoke to a lot of our rangatahi about things that they already had to address in the past, those problem solvings, which they can bring forward and actually use to address climate change issues. So that problem solving and leadership and the ambitions of these communities, and then learn about climate and how to address these issues, which might be barriers to future communities thriving as well. So yeah, knowing that this is very complex, nuanced, but really listening to the community and understanding and making sure that when we're, conducting this research, that it is the community that maintains their agency and sovereignty in this as well. Now, I think there's a couple of links that may have been put into the chat as well. During the Mana Rangatahi project, we actually had 2 small documentary films. They're about 4 or 5 minutes. And they've been put into the chat, I'm pretty sure, one from Te Pā and one from Te Tiriti, and it actually talks about and follows the journeys of these students as they navigate this project as well. So that's it from me, team. Thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. Me taki mata.
Tēnā koe te whanaunga, neira te mihi nunui kia koe. Ki tō tima, te tima o Mana Rangatahi, e mihi kauana tēnei kia koutou katoa. Thank you so much, Mama. Thank you for your energy. Thank you to the Mana Rangatahi team for the work. I think you've raised some really, really important kaupapa and examples to share, and I just want to reflect now before we move on to Kenny, particularly around the importance of the collectives, the importance of our collectives and what that means for us, the intersectionality, that when we are talking about justice for our environment, we also need to talk about justice for our people, for our different diverse collectives, particularly those who experience that intersection in marginalizing and disruptive and violent ways for them. A lot of that marginalization, a lot of that discrimination is born of the same ideologies that create ongoing issues with our taiao, with our environment and our climate. But also just really want to acknowledge the importance around the strengths, the inherent strengths that exist in our communities, and that when we start by acknowledging that, when we grow that from a place, from a context of strength, of aroha, of manaaki, then anything is possible within our communities, including thinking about really big meaty challenges like what we know around climate change as well. Thank you so much for that and for sharing that kōrero so powerfully as well. Yeah, there's so many things I want to tease out, but hold that thought, Naomi, because we have one more amazing speaker left, and I do want to give Kenny a good amount of time to present. So we're going to move on, thank you, Mama, into our kōrero from the amazing economic researcher, Kenny Bell. He comes from a fantastic place in the centre of the North Island, the big metropolis of Pūtāraru. I say that because I also come from Pūtāraru. So Kenny, over to you.
Excuse me. Kia ora, Naomi. Is my screen share working?
No, we can't. Oh, here we go.
There it is. Kia ora, Naomi, for guiding us today. I'll move your faces out of the way too. And kia ora kōrua, Mama and Lauren, for your contributions too. Kia ora, I'm Kenny Bell. I'm here to represent economics, I think, and financial decision making, but also a little bit about how we've gone about sort of measuring some of these equity issues related to climate change. Trying to frame this up as how do we make decisions in the face of climate change? So what decisions are we thinking about in this talk? So not really thinking about emissions reductions decisions, but those decisions that you have to make to respond to climate change as it's happening to you, as those flood levels are increasing, as those temperatures are rising. And so these are decisions that affect the long term and for assets or systems that are in some way exposed to the weather. And a economics or corporate finance kind of perspective for how you might go about this. Might look like forecasting the outcomes of all of the options you have on the table, and then choosing the option with the best forecast. So it sounds easy, but even without climate change, this is pretty hard, and climate change actually makes it even harder. So what climate change does to this decision-making framework is it makes those forecasts of the outcomes much, much less certain, and for many systems, also much worse. And to incorporate climate change into these sorts of long-run investment decisions, you kind of need three ingredients, at least three ingredients. You need a climate change forecast. You need to know what's actually going to happen with climate change, and there's a lot that goes into that. You need to quantify how that future of climate change might impact your system. So Lauren showed us a bit of that in the context of glaciers, for example. But we also, to make these sort of trade-offs between investing resources now and getting improvements in outcomes in the future, you need to have some sort of quantification of the value of those future outcomes. So if it's a profitable business, just forecasting profits might be a way you might do that. But many of these systems we think about involve many important social outcomes, safety, health, community resilience, and all of those sort of need to be taken into account in some way to make these decisions well. All of this is in a background of an economic system which is unequal, and climate future which will hit some people much worse than others. So climate change itself will hit some groups much worse than others, and Mama touched on some of those stories in her kōrero. But policy changes also in response to climate change can privilege some groups over others. So there are these sort of social decisions which can make this problem of inequality worse or better as we face climate change. So what's climate change actually going to do? So I think Lauren discussed a little bit about this, how climate modeling works. So climate models, climate modelers make assumptions about different scenarios of emissions pathways in the future, which doesn't quite tell you what scenario to expect. But there are a few groups who have tried to forecast actually what the future of climate change might look like, considering all of those policy pathways, the geopolitical considerations, all of those things. And so this is one from a group called Rhodium in the United States, and they forecast sort of not much climate action over the coming rest of the century, resulting in their range of about 2 to 4 degrees of global temperature change versus pre-industrial. And there's another group called the Good Judgment Project, which they call themselves these super forecasters, these smart people who've tried to tell the future in a whole bunch of different ways. And they haven't tried to predict climate change directly, but they're predicting in 2050 what emissions might look like. And if you compare that to Rhodium's forecast for 2050, they've got about 30 to 50 billion tons. The super forecasters are a bit more optimistic. So the 30 to 50 range is at the upper end of their distribution. Few of them think we're really going to get our shit together and solve climate change by 2050, but mostly they're thinking we're also in for a bit of moderate climate change. Something like 1.5 to 4 degrees might be what we would expect. Then that next step is quantifying how weather affects the system. So I'll just shout out one of my pieces of research from a few years ago. So I looked at how climate change might affect dairy profitability over the coming century under a couple of these different climate change scenarios. So in this piece of research, we found that profits might go down by about 20% under this high climate change scenario. But if I was using this to make a decision about whether I should be exiting or when I should be exiting dairy farming, I would have to actually consider what the forecast of climate change might be by these sort of geopolitical analysts. And it's actually the green bar here, so this more moderate change, that is looking a bit more likely than the more serious higher climate change scenario that we would face in the sort of upper parts of those forecasts of climate change. Then if we're thinking about quantifying other outcomes other than profitability, it's another sort of very hard problem in many contexts. So if we're thinking about how much safety from flooding is worth, that's a really hard question. There's methods to do it, but I'm not sure the communities involved would agree with those methods. So I think that's would be an important question to tackle if we're going to be doing this quantitative decision making. If we're thinking about investing in flood-prone wastewater plants, and so that gives us better water quality in the future, how much is that water quality in the future worth? How much do we want to trade off investments today to get that better water quality in the future? And there's a long list of other economic and social outcomes which aren't easily valued that are under consideration here when we're making these long-lived decisions about infrastructure for the most part. And then there's the question of which groups are most harmed by climate change or climate change policies. So another piece of research we worked on, we tried to understand for residential insurance, if the insurance industry was going to change their pricing policy from kind of everyone gets the same flood insurance premium, which is roughly the status quo, to a system where every household gets their premium based on their individual household level risk. So if you're at the bottom of a floodplain, your premium would go up quite a lot, potentially very suddenly, if the insurance industry moved suddenly towards this type of pricing policy. The graph I've shown up here is a distribution of those household level premiums. So what a household might be expected to pay if the insurance industry moved quickly to this future of pricing flood insurance based on individualized dwelling level risk. And it's got this nice bell curve shape, but the x-axis is a log scale. So what that means is that this is actually a really skewed distribution, with most households not paying very much. So 90% of dwellings would have a flood premium less than $50. 1% of dwellings would have a flood premium above about $1,600. That's roughly a doubling in your residential insurance. But about 1 in 1,000 dwellings would have a flood premium above $25,000. So that's so high that you're actually in the point where no one will pay that, no one would try to charge it. What it would mean is that those households most at risk would lose their insurance and just be stuck with this flood-prone asset. And then we looked at which groups might be overrepresented in the tail of this distribution, which groups might be more likely to pay more if the insurance industry were to move to this future of higher flood premiums for those most at risk. And we found that Māori households particularly are overrepresented by roughly 33%. So the proportion of Māori households with these high flood premiums is about 33% higher than the proportion of other households with those high flood premiums. So this relates well to that idea of intersectionality that Mama has discussed. For residential flooding, it does look like Māori are hit worse, and actually people on lower incomes are hit even worse by this potential future where insurance is priced based on individualized risk. All of these numbers here don't even take into account climate change. So as we get higher rates of storms, higher sea levels, all of these numbers will go up in the tail and make this this equity issue even worse. Just acknowledge my collaborators across multiple organisations. Certainly it wasn't just me. And that's it. I'll hand back to Naomi. Kia ora koutou.
Tēnā koe, Kenny. Thank you so much for that. Another really interesting and insightful presentation and kōrero, and I guess brings into play a whole another system and a whole nother way of thinking about how we might measure, value or not value different parts of the climate change problem and its impacts on us as people as well. So thank you so much. Really found that really interesting, and I think there's a few things we can kind of pull out, particularly when we're thinking about how we respond to climate change as individuals and as communities and what that might mean. And I think across all of the presentations, what the question that comes to mind for me, if I can kind of use this as a starting point for our discussion, but really is what do you think it will take for us to take action? So whether that's a farmer thinking about their profits and or their way of farming to then potentially mitigate the impacts that they might see both on their profitability but also on the environment, whether that's people taking action, Lauren, to see discernible change in what's happening with our snow and ice on our glaciers, or Mama, whether that's taking action to actually really invest in communities and community spaces as an adaptation response to climate change. What is, I know this is like I'm starting with the big meaty question, the question that's on the top of our minds, but what, from your perspective, what do we need to do? What do we need to do as individuals? What do we need to do as researchers? What do we need to do as communities to start to see some action? I'll direct the conversation. Hopefully no one's looking away, but I'm going to go back the way we came. We'll go Kenny, Mama, and then Lauren.
Kia ora, Naomi. I think it will require a diversity of strategies to encourage the behaviour change that will result in really good outcomes. So yeah, some of those bigger businesses with lots of resources will have their own analyst teams analysing all of the outputs of the research and using that to make really good decisions. And then households with not much resources at all will need a lot of guidance from researchers, from community leaders, from it will require a diversity of strategies to get that information and advice into action. And same goes for farmers, I think. So I think farmers have that variety of institutions. Some farming institutions have lots of resources. Some, won't change even if you're pulling their teeth out. It will require a diversity of strategies for farming as well.
Kia ora, thanks, Kenny. Mama.
Yeah, I think I do. What is the thing, right? What is the thing that's going to get us through? And I struggle because I don't know, in a system of capitalism, how we will ever not prioritize profit over people. Do you know what I mean? So if we continue to do things how they are, I don't know if there'll be something big enough to really shift that. But that's why we talk so much about collectivism and community, because whether it be climate change or not, the issues that our people as individuals or community are facing, that often we see them being able to get through them better, in that community kind of way. And also a lot of the folks that we spoke to, when they talk about things like climate change or these issues that they're facing, a lot of them if they didn't necessarily care about the issue, it's because they couldn't see themselves in the conversation. So even a lot of the Pacific folks that I talked to when they learned about climate change for the first time at school, it was always talked about as something very distant for them. But as Indigenous people, the environment is not something that is separate from us. It's not a conversation that we see as inherently over there. It's actually inherently part of who we are. So in order to take care of us, we actually have to take care of the thing that is also part of us. Does that make sense? Is that weird? So I think that's why building on collectivism and community also welcomes people in a sense of that belongingness as well. Obviously, that's a very, very small part of that, but I also think how we discuss these issues is massive. Like an example that I use in my own research is like when I go to the Cook Islands, I went to Aitutaki. One of the mamas I spoke to didn't want to talk about climate change, but she could easily talk to me about the changing and color of the corals and how when she plants it has to be different times of the year and how the coconut trees are drying out. We're talking about the same thing. You know what I mean? It's just the language in which we're using it, and oftentimes it's a real Western or Eurocentric way that we're trying to communicate things to people that already know. Do you know what I mean? That we already know we're doing the same thing. So yeah, so just making sure that, once again, coming back to that intersectionality of how we're navigating these spaces and, you know, the decision making and the issues that we're trying to, you know, address, we're just making sure that everyone has a seat at the table, and if you don't have a seat at the table, then flip the table. Do you know what I mean? It's a very radical way of thinking about it, but yeah.
Love it. Thanks, Mama. I'll pass over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kenny and Mama. I shouldn't say this as a physical scientist, but often, especially in kind of discussions like this, feel like and am reminded that there's not some big physical science breakthrough or piece of research that's going to be done that changes everything. It's kind of people thinking about how we're working together and thinking about these problems. And that scientific research can help guide us in where we need to go and what we need to do to address these problems. But yeah, really just echoing what the others have said and kind of the way we as communities think about this.
Thanks, Lauren. If I can kind of build off that and kind of from that, I think, you know, that point that you've just made around that not necessarily needing to be some huge, big scientific breakthrough. I'm reminded of the work of Kyle White, who's an Indigenous scholar who talks about relational tipping points, as well as we need to think about this in the sense of relational tipping points as well as ecological tipping points. And, you know, I know Kenny and Lauren, you've used, you know, a few different ranges, that if it's 2 degrees, if it's 5 degrees, if it's this bracket, if it's this bracket, then these are the scenarios. And one of the things that he talks about is that relational tipping points actually have already been reached. We've already breached the relational tipping points. And he's talking in relation to Indigenous peoples as well. And he talks about our response to climate change, both in terms of kind of state responses, but also in terms of community responses, as needing to be much more relationally accountable and grounded. And so how do we do that in the context when people are looking for you know, decisions that can be, you know, uncertain at times and then not that uncertain at other times? He talks about things like trust, consent, accountability, reciprocity. How do we build those into our models of decision making, of research, of engaging with this thing called climate change? And I also just want to pick up on your point, Mama, around the kind of languaging around climate change. That's definitely been the same kind of feedback that we've had from many of our Māori communities doing rangahau in the vision mātauranga space, that, you know, they won't use the words climate change, but they can tell you when the river changed colour. They can tell you the history of the land and the kind of resulting impacts that have occurred. And so I think we also need to be really mindful of how is climate change and how is the vernacular of climate change a language of exclusion as opposed to a language of inclusion. How do we make the shift from a language of exclusion to a language of inclusion? And And so I think, oh, sorry, I've just seen Elena's. Kyle White, I'll put the link to the article in the chat. So really thinking again about that intersectionality, about the diversity, Kenny, that you were talking about, that we need multiple ways of making decisions, but also how do we do that in a way that is just and equitable across all of our communities, and that might look to redistribute power in different ways. I won't make you answer that question because, again, that's just a big, bold statement. What I do want to do now, though, is come back to our roles as researchers. What does it mean as researchers? What keeps you going in the work that you do, first of all, is kind of one question as a researcher. And particularly when you're doing research and perhaps not seeing the corresponding outcome in terms of political decision making or behavior change, or you know, yeah, the I guess the inherent kind of sometimes, well, if I speak for myself, the kind of conflict that can sometimes arise. Or disillusionment, perhaps, is the word. I know we talked about hopefulness and you all touched on kind of on what makes you hopeful, but I guess at a personal level as researchers, what keeps you doing the work that you're doing, yeah, in your respective research areas? We'll go the same way. Kenny, Mama, Lauren.
Kia ora, Naomi. What keeps me going? We should name it. The funding environment has changed a lot. That is changing the landscape of what we can do as a research community over the coming years. I'm very lucky to have secure funding for a few years, so that's like keeping me going, but I know I'll be losing colleagues in this space unless something changes very quickly in the near term. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm in that privileged position to have secure funding. I think the message we send as researchers can be tailored to the audience somewhat. So the different political parties will respond differently to different messages coming out of our research. Climate change affects everybody. It's not something that is sort of necessarily politically aligned, so yeah, I think just trying my best to keep any small influence I might have tailored to the audience of the day would be sort of how I'm thinking about moving forward over the next few years.
Kia ora, Kenny. Mama.
I think I actually thought about this a lot when I was halfway through. I actually almost quit my thesis because I thought, I was thinking about what is my role of the researcher? And we know like Indigenous communities are one of the most researched peoples in the entire world, right? So I was like, what am I contributing? And also, what am I taking away? Am I causing harm? And also recognizing that not everything is actually supposed to be shared. Do you know what I mean? There is knowledge that actually is quite sacred, and also being mindful of where that knowledge is going. So knowing that I'm part of an institution actually that is heavily influenced, if not the foundations of colonization. So where is this really sacred knowledge and these really beautiful sharings that have been, shared with me by the community? What am I doing with that? So these questions I think about constantly, but the thing that keeps me going as a researcher is knowing that it's just we're all playing different roles. And I always thought, well, am I doing enough here? Could I be doing something better? But the universe just, pointed me in a certain direction, and this is where I am. So in any way that I can serve my community, this is just a really, really small part of that. And also there's so much, like, we know there's power dynamics that exist between as researchers and the communities that we potentially work with, making sure that they understand, because there's been so many times where they always think you're the smartest person in the room. Don't get me wrong, love when they think that, but it's like the consultation and the stuff, we're going to community. You are the ones that have the knowledge and the, you know, the beauty that we're, you know, trying to communicate in different ways. So I think what keeps me going is knowing that you don't have to be everything all at once and do everything all at once. That's why the beautiful thing about coming back to community and collectivism is everyone just has these roles to play, and, you know, being a researcher is just one of them.
Kia ora, Mama Lauren.
Yeah, I think, or I did start studying or become interested in climate change because it feels like this really important problem for us to think about and to address. And it has only felt kind of more important over the past kind of 10 years that I've been in this space from school and working. And then I guess specifically when I think about snow and glaciers, it's such a beautiful environment. So people study climate change by looking at cores of sediments from under the ocean. But one of the reasons that kind of got me to where I am and probably keeps me there is working in these beautiful places. And just wanting other people to be able to experience them too.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you all. I think, you know, again, you've raised some really important things, both around our kind of personal motivations for doing what we do, but also our ability to do that. You know, the funding that comes or doesn't come, depending on the particular agenda of the day, the particular kinds of priorities, the particular kind of research that we may or may not be doing. You know, our opportunities to connect, I guess the accountability and responsibility we have outside of even being a researcher, coming, you know, first and foremost. Lauren, I'm wondering if I can just pick up on, you know, your love of the snow in particular, and I'm going to ask this question specifically. I know I said I wasn't going to ask individual questions, but there has been a few people asking. You know, one of the themes I think that has come through in the kōrero today is around, you know, our connection to the environment, and that looks different and it's quite diverse. And sometimes it's very proximate, right? Sometimes it's right there and we can feel it and see it and taste it and smell it. And other times it actually feels like it's quite distant, even though what is happening there impacts us. Whether that's through our economic systems or insurance or our communities. So you obviously have a program around connecting girls to the snow and ice. Can you share a little bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking about it. It's part of this larger program called Inspiring Girls Expeditions, which started in the US about 25 years ago with the goal of showing girls that science and exploring the outdoors are things that are interesting and can be accessible to them. And they're things that you can find jobs in, but even if you don't find a job in, it can be part of your life. And the expeditions are completely free for students. So the idea is getting people who wouldn't have otherwise had these opportunities, sometimes financial, but maybe their family is just not going to prioritize doing that over something else, and taking them into these spaces. And so we've had one Girls on Ice expedition here in New Zealand where we went to Mount Ruapehu this past January. And we are just about to open applications for our next expedition, which will be the same place, the same time of year. And I think there was something else I wanted to say about it, but I'm not thinking of that right now. So yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Lauren. And we did put the link, I think, up in the chat further to that if anyone is interested. But I did just want to kind of reflect on that, our ability to connect to the taiao. And yeah, fantastic to hear that it's an accessible opportunity for.
Yeah, and maybe this wasn't what I was thinking of, but one of the things that's really lovely about it is it's not just science or the outdoors, or art. So art's also a big part of it. It's kind of ties all of them together, like you're saying. So how can we do our science better by kind of incorporating these art techniques, and how can we explore the outdoors with kind of those other knowledges? So really, yeah, showing how everything's intertwined.
Beautiful. Mama, I feel like there's like a Pacific girl contingent that's going to be up on the ice with Lauren in the next round. I feel like this could be a thing. Just
Well, if it involves me, then it's definitely not going to be a thing. But I support from my non-ice funny. I'll support from the ground.
fine. We're not quite out of time. There is a question, and I'm not going to ask whether all panelists want to answer this, but I'm going to put the question from Murray to the panel before I wrap up with one last question for us. But it's a meaty one, Murray. But does capitalism and collective community approaches need to be seen as mutually exclusive? If anyone has thoughts and wants to kind of riff on that question, please feel free to weigh in. There's a second part of it. I'll read the second part of the question while you think on that. As you know more about our governance system and institutional arrangements around within it to redistribute power, are they mutually exclusive? What are your thoughts, Kenny?
I think we live in a country of capitalism, mostly a world of capitalism, and a world with lots of examples of collective community approaches. So I think no, I think can make collective community approaches more challenging. But no, I don't see them as mutually exclusive.
Thanks, Kenny. Any other of the other panelists want to weigh in? One of the things I would kind of add into the conversation, though, is for us to consider, and I know there is work being done on this, but what are alternative economies? Yes, we live in a world that is predominantly capitalist, but what are some of the other alternative economies that exist or have existed in our world? Indigenous economies, economies of love, economies of reciprocity, that we can start to build alternatives. What does that look like to build alternative economies that are more aligned to a relational accountability to our environment, etc. So I'll just kind of throw that there in the mix, that we're not, we don't feel hamstrung by what is existing, but that we actually, one, challenge that. At the same time, how do we create alternatives? How do we rebirth the alternatives that existed previously as well? And what might that do for our economic modelling, for our climate modelling, for our community cohesiveness, etc. One final question for our panel before we wrap up. This is a more personal question, but we are keen. We're coming to the end of the Deep South National Science Challenge. I know that the work doesn't stop there. I know that our community's work didn't start and end with the science challenges. And I know that you all will have had a diverse range of experiences in your research careers. So what is one just standout research moment that you have had in your research? Standout moment. I didn't put this question to them earlier, so everyone's thinking on the fly.
All right, I have one. I shared a little bit about that work on flood insurance and how it relates to equity. Fully expected to find that the richer people with the bigger houses would pay more in their flood insurance premiums. And we found the opposite. It is the people on lower incomes that have the higher flood risk, higher flood insurance premiums on average. There's definitely plenty of rich people with flash houses who are at risk of flooding. But yeah, that's probably stood out for me as a big surprise in my research.
Kia ora, Kenny. Mama?
I think one of the biggest ones, there was amazing moments, but one of the biggest ones for us was actually our young people presented to Christchurch City Council. And when we got, it was to get them in a room in the very beginning talking about what they wanted to see and let them know that we're going to put them in a space where these head honchos, these big guys, can actually make those changes that they wanted to see in their community, which was so powerful, and to give them access to those kind of connections and networks and practice with them. And starting from the very beginning, where a lot of them, like even the public speaking part of it was really, for some of them anyway, quite challenging. And then to see them eventually practice and kind of figure out these ideas and what they really wanted, whether it be the gardens or more cycle lanes, or making sure that their rugby fields weren't, you know, flooded every time they went to go play, all these things. And then being able to present to council, and their voices and their experiences were so powerful. And then we were like, now do something about it, council. Like, you got these young people that are just out here now being already, like we said, already having these ideas in some regard and having these wants and these passions, but now putting them in front of you. Yeah, and now there's an expectation. Like, so that was that was a really, really big thing for us. So I'm so proud of them. So yeah, presenting to Christchurch City Council was a big one for us.
Amazing. Kia ora, mama. Lauren.
Oh, this is such a roller coaster one for me. A lot of our results kind of show these examples of climate change that are not great, but I guess when you first see them, it's almost quite exciting. If we were monitoring glacier change and there was just no change year after year, there'd be kind of no, oh wow, look at this result. But then when we do get these big results of kind of heaps of snow and ice melting, it can be quite kind of exciting to see something dramatic, and then you think about what's happening. So maybe instead of a research question, we did get to present some of our work to Helen Clark a few years back, who has an interest in science, but also in the outdoors from some mountaineering interests. And so just getting to talk with her about what we do was very cool.
Amazing. Tēnā koutou. Nei rā te mihi nunu kia koutou katoa. I think this webinar, this panel has really demonstrated that we exist in an ecosystem of connection, of connectivity, of physical connections that, you know, the images from Lauren around the kind of physical ecosystem that exists, the economic ecosystem that is layered over, the community, people ecosystems that exist, biological ecosystems that serve either to support or not support those connections. The moana, te moana nui a kiwa, as a point of connection for us, not as a point of separation from the rest of the world as well. And so I just want to acknowledge our panelists. Thank you for bringing and leaning into this discussion. I know that we all are in really diverse positions, but thank you for feeding part of that ecosystem with your presentations and with your experience and with the work that you do. We really, really appreciate it. To those of you who are still here listening, thank you for engagement in the chat. This webinar will be made available online as well, so feel free to share it. This is the last webinar of the Deep South National Science Challenge. So I can't say what I usually say is look out for the next one, but this is us signing off. I will close us with karakia. A te whakaitanga e, te whakaitanga e, tēnei te wānanga ka ea, tēnei te mauri o te wānanga, ka whakamoia, koa ki runga, koa ki raro, haumi e, hui e, tāe ki. Tēnā koutou.